books with their authors. Today, we have the pleasure of having Ms. Rajkotia with us, who has recently authored the book Unpartitioned Time. A little bit about Ms. Malavika Rajkotia, though she needs no introduction, is that she is the founder of Rajkotia Associates, a leading divorce law firm in India, with almost 4 decades in a wide range of practice areas, including family and property law and civil liberties. She also anchored the first Hindi talk show focused on women's rights in India called Shakti. Ms. Rajkotia's first book, Intimacy Undone, examined the complexities of marital relations and disruptions in India, providing insight into the practice of family law through a gendered lens. This is also a book we referred to very extensively during our family law.
Oh, that's nice.
And now with this latest book, Unpartitioned Time, Ms. Rajkotia ventures into the more personal sphere of her family's history. It is truly difficult to pigeonhole this book, I would say, into one genre, although it does flow seamlessly, I would say, from politics to history, to family, to spirituality and culture, in this wonderful, very human, very hard narrative that I personally really enjoyed. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Rajkotia to our. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, ma'am.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm glad, again, it's a roundtable setting, so it's very amenable to questions. I'm hoping I don't monopolize too much of your time and we leave some for others as well. So I have been quite in awe of this book and I'm very excited to discuss it. So we'll start with maybe the partition is kind of an overarching theme in the book.
Yes.
So perhaps with that, I would say that the pain of the partition carries throughout your book, but so does a certain sense of hope and longing to return almost. So I think you mentioned that after 1947, the Ardas had a verse.
Yes,
talks about wanting to go back to the Gurdwara.
Absolutely. Thank you for obviously you've read it carefully. Then thank you. That's just So those towards the end of the Ardas in any Gurdwara nowadays, when if you listen, the last is that grant us the vision, the sight of the Gurdwaras that have been torn away from us, which basically means Nankana Sahib, Kartarpur, many other similar places that were lost to divided Punjab and went into Pakistan. So that's really become part of the identity culturally.
Right.
It's not still treating as, anyway, you asked, but yes, that is, it was aware. So the Ardas, the reason why I put all of it there is that it's almost the entire history of the Sikhs, beginning with Guru Nanak.
Yes.
Has them all by name. And then it has Guru Gobind, and after that, Guru Gobind said there will be no human successor, it's the book. And then, of course, Chali Mukte, all the battles that Guru Gobind fought, and the constant Islamophobes, they fought the Muslims. But no, they fought oppression. And at that point, oppression in Delhi was the Mughal. I mean, otherwise it could be any type of oppression. And that too, therefore, becomes part of the narrative, and that becomes the identity, a Sikh identity to a great extent. And then part of history is also woven into the Ardas again with this thing of the partition. So it's an evolving prayer in an interesting sort of way, which I've not come across elsewhere, but then I don't know other religions as well as I know this. I'm not sure I still call myself a Sikh, but yes, I would identify as a Sikh. I like the philosophy of it, but then I like that of most religions.
So, ma'am, do you think this interplay between the trauma and the pain that the partition brought on and this longing to return, how does it persist through the generation? So you said the Ardas is probably one example. The key that you spoke about that your grandmother kept in her closet, hoping that she'll go back.
Yeah, I think after some time, it was not that she was hoping to go back, but then the keys were there.
Right.
So there was no way that she would lose those keys. So it just became a relic from that time past. But yes, initially when partition happened, I am told by whoever, my parents, my grandmother, and anybody alive now, very few, who will tell you that they were genuinely under the impression that once the riots sort of calmed down, then they would all be able to go back to their home. So at the book launch, for example, Kushwant Singh's son Rahul Singh spoke at my book launch. And now Rahul was about 9 years old when partition happened. So he's, I think, one of the older survivors from, he's not a midnight study. Like people like Kapil Sibal and all are born a year after, just in 47. But Rahul Singh is, Kapil's parents are also from there, but he's born late. So Rahul Singh was telling me that in Lahore, his father at that time was in the foreign service, or I can't remember something. And he put his kids in the car and with the nanny and so on, and said, "Now you drive from Lahore to Delhi, and we'll send for you in a few days." So Kushwant Singh then, in fact, describes that time in an essay which I read, where he says that I did exactly that. I sent my wife and my children away, and I used to watch from my terrace in the Lahore house the fires around. But they seemed to be getting closer. And when I felt they were getting too close, the essay ends with I got into my car and drove away. It's literally that.
So there
Yes, in fact, even Jinnah retained his house in Bombay for that reason, because I don't think even Jinnah expected it to be like this.
Right. So now I think another central theme that comes up, especially in your father's life, is the importance of stillness or aram or thera that you speak.
No, that is just sheer lethargy and that's what I'm saying. It begins with Oblomov for that reason. He's just an incredibly lazy man.
I think you do also have this beautiful line where you say that's when I understood why my father began laying down. So there was some
So
sort
that's an interpretation. I mean, he was a very fiercely intelligent, fiercely thinking man of depth when he talked. So clearly he wasn't, he wasn't slothful. He wasn't just going to lie there.
Yeah.
So if I had to then give a interpretation of what was this representation and why did he not feel like moving, in my head, I connect it to this yearning and great disillusionment.
And there was also a difference in how he reacts to the 47 partition as opposed to 84, right?
Yes.
When the riots happened, because I noticed 47, he was forced to flee and he had to get on a train and he was home behind.
No, so in 47, actually, they were holidaying in Simla or in Kashmir.
Yeah.
And then he and his cousin, his chacha, actually,
when they
the
were-
same age as him,
Yeah.
were put in a train to go back to Lahore, and it was thought safe. Post-August, it was thought safe to say, okay, just go, pack up the house, bring some things, And it was at the Lahore station, the station master recognized them and said, "Are you crazy? Do you know what can happen?" Even their mother went with them. Pipiji had also gone. So then they got into the next train and they came back.
Right.
So that's that whole story. 84, yes. 84, the mob came into the house, and my mother and my grandmother were in the house. My sister and I were in Delhi at that time in university. So my mother and grandmother obviously locked the doors and were inside the house. And my father had been sitting outside in the veranda. And he just said, "I'm done.
Yeah, he
I'm
refused to even
not even going to get up. I am not going to go into the house. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to run. I'm just going to sit." And that's what he did, which I takes something, right? But I think a lot to do also with the mob, how they react then to that kind of stillness, was that they did not get aggressive and they just left. A part of it could be that there was a list in any case, and our house didn't figure that list, but they had happened to come in because it is a prominent house in Karnal. But whatever it is, this was his reaction.
Right. Yeah. That contrast between him kind of having to flee as opposed and that disruption.
And now it was like that.
Yeah, it was very stark for sure. Ma'am, you also discussed this idea of Punjabiyats. This is the first time I've come across the term as a Punjabi, so it says something about me in this way. But I think it stems from this inherent blend of communal identities, being Persian identities, and Sikhism and Islam and Hinduism.
Yes.
And it also finds roots in the
I'm a Sufi.
And Sufism.
Sufism is also came, yes, it came to Delhi as well, the silsila, which was the Aulia silsila, but the Sufis came from Afghanistan and over that region, Turkey, Afghanistan, and settled here and melded with Punjab. So Sufism is very, very Punjab, and then of course comes to Delhi as a guard in many
Right. So it's a very amalgamated, very refined idea.
syncretic faith,
For sure.
basically.
And ma'am, also a lot of the Punjabiyat you speak about is rooted in the region itself, right? You talk about how fertility and rains obviously influence a lot of the life.
Yes.
How the colors also named after different foods,
Yes.
which I found very fascinating. I never thought about how yellow is called basant.
Yes.
Or purple is called, I think, was it Pyazi?
Pyazi.
Jamuni.
Jamuni.
Purple is Jamuni. Right. So I was curious what this notion of Punjabiyat has meant to you and your family, and how do you think it lives through the generations? Like, does it fade? Does it transform?
Well, truth be told, which I've again mentioned, that a lot of it has to do with language.
Right.
So loss of language is loss of a lot. And to that extent, I'm still lucky compared to many of my own generation who were born to Sikh households like mine, that my Punjabi is fluent, I can read it, I can write it, and so on. But my children, that's my fault, my children don't. So really, what they will know of Punjab and Punjabiyat will be more intuitive, perhaps what they picked up from me, but it will not be overtly cultural in any way, really, because they've not also lived in Punjab, so they don't know, the traditional. For example, while my parents were alive, my mother, till more recently in Savan, even while we are here, but there would be the kheer and the pura which would be sent to us from the farm and so on. And it's difficult to keep up with those kind of, little customs. So it goes. And yet I choose not to call it the end of the world or tragedy, because something comes, something evolves. The idea is not to hang on to one thing and think it's the only way. That's really part of the book as well.
Yeah, definitely. It does evolve and transform.
Yes.
Or export in some sense. Ma'am, also a lot of your book, even though its family history is marked by these huge historical events that happen along the way.
Yes.
Like the assassination of Miss Gandhi as well. I think you were in law school.
I was in law school.
Back at the time in Delhi. And there's this very interesting scene where her cousin reassured her, saying that Section 144 has been imposed and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
Which I love your response. Your response was that your faith in Section 144 is very touching.
Yeah.
Probably one of my favorite scenes. So, I mean, just as a lawyer, but I'd love to know your perspective on how Section 144 is evolved, now 163 of the VNSS.
Yeah,
Ever since
I
the
can't even
assassination.
wrap my head around the new name. People actually call it that. I still call it now I'll say the new IPC,
New
the new
IPC.
evidence.
New CRP.
Too much.
New CRP.
It's too much. I mean, so now you move to a different subject, which I'm happy to respond to as a lawyer.
Right.
But I'm reading that currently what I'm working on is a law. It's called, the working title is Laws Patriarchy. So one element of it is, and it's a feminist perspective. So one element of it is obviously women and violence. So I was reading, there's a series like Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Jacqueline Rose. So one of those authors, I can't remember which, has said that the state has enactments like this not to remove violence or protect the individual from violence as much as to monopolize it. And that's really the important thing. And 144, for example, eventually we know that the riots, be it in Delhi in 84 and all over the country, and be it 2002 in Gujarat, were all state-sponsored monopolies. So that's really my comment at the moment. Otherwise, we've not seen it work, which is why my extremely cynical response at that, even still as a student. unfortunately remains the same.
Yeah, I think you kind of preempted the.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a like since we do a lot of legislative drafting, my follow-up wants to be that how do you re-envision Section 144? Maybe that's a
Section
conversation.
144, yeah, it's a completely different area. Yes, I mean, it certainly can't be here.
Yeah.
But the most important, it's not Section 144 as much as to ensure that the state machinery that time is truly independent.
Right.
But it's not. Even when we talk of separation of powers nowadays, you're seeing the complete, almost amalgamation at some level. The photograph of the PM and the CJI is only an undercurrent. I mean, it's, it was fairly. But of course, now he's saying it's fiercely independent and so on, and it may well be. One doesn't know the inner, whatever the dynamics are. But certainly the executive, which is supposed to be independent, treats itself as has merged itself and amalgamated itself into the legislature because it is the ruling party in parliament.
Right.
Whereas the executive was supposed to be entirely different, to be able to tell a minister that no, you can't do this. That lovely show, Yes, Minister. That's truly the thing of the executive maintaining its rigorous independence. Ministers can come and go forever, but we guys are here.
Yeah, I think we were discussing Yes Minister recently.
Yeah, it's a fab show. And then later, yes, Prime Minister. I mentioned it here also. It's one of the earliest shows that Doordarshan, these were the early shows which we used to watch.
Yeah.
They used to have.
Oh, they have Yes Minister.
Yeah. That time as well is not.
Hindi version as well, which had come called G Mantri Ji. Jayant Kriplani.
So ma'am, just coming back to your book, I found the surrounding characters in very fascinating as well. I think you mentioned that your grandfather's brother was either a constable or a policeman, and Sardar Patel had requested him directly asking for.
Yeah, he was an officer. He was a police officer.
Yes. And your father's school friend going on to become a Baloch leader as well.
Yeah, Akbar Bhukti,
Yes.
who was
The eminent Baloch leader. Yeah.
yes,
And he went to boarding school with that.
So he and my dad were in boarding school together. So again, the cultural difference, because Akbar, when we had gone, we met Bhukti as a matter of fact. But when Bhukti and my dad were in school, Bhukti was already married. So, and he had a child. So the cultural difference was, when at 15, you were married and you had kids.
Right.
Of course, my dad had other racy stories about his visits to Hira Mandi and all, but that's
Yeah, maybe they should have done some recon with your dad. And then also there was a subplot about Teja Singh Chulkhana, which I
yes.
found very, very interesting / entertaining as well. If you could share the story. And
So Teja Singh Chulkhana, actually I didn't know that much about him except that he was there very much in Pipiji's ashram, and I used to always find him as very strange and this old man.
Right.
And like I've written that he was very fierce and everybody was a little scared of him, but I was the only one who was allowed to jump on his back. He used to constantly be lying under a guava tree. And then he was old by then. And I asked my mother, but it's much later that again an interesting blend in Punjab, that the tailor was a writer and a poet. So the tailor was called Shivnath, who my grandaunt met at a literary sabha in Sarhand.
Right.
That's the equivalent of your Jaipur Lit Festival,
Right.
perhaps. So there, this tailor, Shivnath, recited some of his poetry, and my grandaunt was very impressed, and they became friends, and she'd come often to the ashram. And that's when they interviewed Teja Singh Chulkhana, because he used to not talk much. He'd been through a lot, as you can see. He was on death row. He was waiting for the death sentence had been pronounced. He was in Kalapani. Kalapani was after. So he was waiting to be hanged. That was the like early the next morning was the hanging, and the morning arrived and the sun had well risen, and there was nobody. So what would you be going through in your head in any case that you're going to be hanged? And then somebody comes and says, no, they've decided they're not going to hang you, but they're sending you to the Andamans. So suddenly that's bound to have had its own shock and effect. And then his life about going to the Andamans, then becoming, and of course, he was there in all of this was his political life because he was a Gadar party member. That was one of the earliest independent movements and in Punjab, very strongly and mostly funded by Punjabis and Sikhs living abroad. That's where the money used to come most of the time. And then that Kamagatu Maru incident that had happened and so on had all fueled this revolutionary fire. So, but Gadar party was a party which was believed in violence to that extent, right? It was not really, it's before Gandhi. So, to that extent, then he was in the Lahore bombing incident. That's where he got picked up and more by association and then ordered to be hanged. But then he's very funny also about, which is the book, which Shivnath has written in Gurmukhi. Which that's how because I can read it, I enjoyed it very much. And he describes his time in he met Bhagat Singh in jail in Lahore, and then in Andaman. And there, the reason why I've spent so long writing those names because they are such fun. Baba Tej Singh Tukha, those kind of names. So when I read them aloud because they just have so much rhythm, which is great sound. So I've used it for that reason as all the names. And then it's quite funny again because these Gadris were arrested and they were in jails all over. So when Andamans he was released from, so he was actually freed. It was not a full life sentence, even though it was death that had been commuted. I think they probably didn't think he was that important at the end, even though at one point they thought he was important enough to hang, but whatever. Then he describes his various, then he goes to Gujarat and meets Gandhi. Gandhi gives him what he calls a ruka, a note. And he goes to all these various places. He goes to Trichinopoli, he goes to all these places, Madras and so on, where all the Gadris, most of them Sikhs, are there. And what was very funny is that when he says, what can I do for you? They say, we are sick of sambar chawal. So he had to constantly leave money with the jailer to say, please buy wheat and give them rotis. He used to get rations for them. So that was quite funny. And of course, the way the book is written, I mean, if you in Punjabi, if you say martial law, that's what it was, na? So I've written it as martial law. Because that's how they say it. MARSHALLAH, martial law. Which again, I love these sounds, so I try to use them a lot stylistically in the book as well.
Sure, yeah, it's a very solid book that way. I appreciate how much of the Punjabi also you've retained and translated.
Yeah.
It's very nicely done. I think my final question before I open up to everyone else was so my teammates were recently talking about our first memory of a major news event, and we were talking about how that might have shaped our political consciousness. I think our news events are very cursory in comparison, but the one that you spoke about was hearing the bombs during the Indo-Pakistan war in '65 when you were 3 years old.
Yes.
I still remember that.
Yeah.
And the '71 war followed by the ceasefire is also very much a lived memory.
Yes.
So do you think that seeing such events at such a young age, its formative years, has shaped you in any way, affected you?
No, I don't think so. Because I mean, I think it would have if something horrible had happened, right? Because otherwise, like I've said, as a 3-year-old, I was, nobody was I don't remember anybody panicking. So when the siren would go off, then I would be picked up. My great grandfather would be woken up to say, "Chalo, we'll go to the trench," and he would say, "Nahi, I'm just going to sleep, and if I have to go, I'm go in my bed." So he would refuse to go to the trench. Then my grandmother, my father, and my mother and myself, we'd be in the trench, and the trench was. It was something funny and different, and we are there, and it was nicely done up with a tari and a little nooda for me, etc. I just thought it was great fun.
It's like a sleepover.
Yeah, like a sleepover, different. And then, of course, 71, I was in boarding school. So that again broke the monotony of boarding school, right? Because so we had to have blankets under our beds and carry warm socks in our dressing gown pockets. Because the idea was that if you have to run, so the first siren you go under the bed, and there's a blanket already there because it was cold.
Yeah.
And then the second siren meant that you had to go out. So which means you quickly wear your warm dressing gown, but rather than running around for socks, they're in your pocket and you quickly wear them and run. So there were drills.
Right.
And I don't think anybody really believed that the bomb would fall there, right? So to that extent, again, it was fun. And I told my mother that. And my mother was very, very said, don't say that. Your uncles from both sides of your family are fighting in the front. And which is my father's older brother, Tayaji. He retired as a brigadier. And my mother's older brother, he retired as a general. In those days, they were young officers. So I hadn't thought and I didn't think they would die, one doesn't think like that, sadly. But of course, there were daughters of army officers there. And I only remember one very funny, and I thought it was funny, Ritu Vij, who said, "Oh my God, I wish my father was a cook in the army." You see, because then it's less chance that the cook will die, right? Rather than somebody in the front. But I've turned it again where Sardar front ho gaya is a very funny thing, right? So when my mother said, both your mama ji and your taya ji are fighting at the front.
Yeah.
My reaction was again laughter at the thought of ki Sardar front ho gaya, because that is always that image of one crazy beard this way going balle balle and running, which we grew up with. So it's a mixture of this and that.
Right.
So, but yeah, these are memories that I don't think define my being as much as now pepper my childhood as I remember it as being different and therefore interesting in some ways.
So shocking
For that, yeah. Thank God for that. I mean, one doesn't want interesting times. I wouldn't want my children to live in interesting times. Interesting times are disturbing always.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think because of your father, notice there's a thread of almost levity and humor that comes in these kind of situations.
Yeah.
Like even during the partition during 84, he said he would cut his hair off because he wanted to stay good looking.
Yeah. If I shaved my beard, I won't be that good looking.
Which was a stunning response to such a tense situation.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I love that contrast.
Yeah.
Cool. So I won't take up more of your time, ma'am. I would love to open the floor to questions about ma'am's book, her work, anything like. Go ahead.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Aditya. I've been very curious about partition recently. I've just discovered some family history of late. And so since we're all based in Delhi, I've been trying to do whatever I can in this city. So I visited the Dara Shikoh Library.
Yes, of course. That's Kishwar's.
Yes.
Yeah.
And apart from that, the Purana Killa, where they hosted a lot of refugees.
Yeah.
But I was wondering what more can one do in Delhi to learn about partition, or at least the limited role that Delhi had to play in the
That's
partition.
interesting. But I mean, I think the early refugee camps, which then became colonies, is also there were all these
Yes.
rehabilitation colonies, and then of course Ramchandra Guha has written about in one of his very large books. So you'll have to see which one. Huh?
India after Gandhi.
Yeah, not his most recent one, the very early one. Yeah. India after Gandhi. And in that, in fact, he's described some very interesting cases because you see, a lot of the land that was given here, or even to my parents, my father's family in Karnal, was a compensation, albeit the point is it was a token compensation compared to what they had there. But it was, but that land subsequently, like one Sundarnagar, one of the very wealthy families there got a house in Sundarnagar as compensation. So that's, so that's why the post-partition next generation, how they benefited from the move is interesting.
Right.
But of course, interestingly again, it'll have to be that the privilege of that time, even though considerably diluted post-partition, like my family was obviously a family of privilege there. And what it came to was very, very diluted what we got. But in a way, and that is not true of all the refugees here. So the relativity of the privilege, non-privilege, the class issue kind of carried over. You got compensation only if you had something there. Now, of course, there were other smaller houses which are all in these various. You'll have to check which are the rehabilitation colonies. Even Lajpat Nagar, there are, and some in East Delhi. So these next generation, how they have benefited from the rise in land prices has been, it would be interesting. That
Even CR part for the Bengalis, it used to be called EPDP, and like East Pakistan displaced persons.
there you go.
Yeah,
There
and-
you go.
No, and in Calcutta, I mean, and so this is also this about this relative privilege because just the CR part was of course called refugees who came mostly around 1971.
Yes.
Around that time. So essentially, I mean, and this is no judgment, but this is growing up in Calcutta. This was a trope that we heard all the time. People tended to look down upon Bengalis who were Bengalis in Calcutta used to look down upon Bengalis in CR part quite a lot.
Yes.
And so because it used to be called East Pakistan Displaced Persons Colony, and so it shortens into EPDP. So we all used to call it EPTP, and TP, this word means heap.
Oh, there
Like
you
a
go.
heap of Bengalis.
Yeah.
So there's always this point about relative privilege.
Yes.
And mind you, 60% of Bengalis in Calcutta are all from what is Bangladesh. Right?
Yes.
And so we are all from Bangladesh.
Originally
From there, but just had come a long time
But
before.
could have been, but then there was the prior Bengal partition of
Yeah, so
1905.
Bengal actually that way is a little bit different from Punjab because there have been waves that have
That's
come
right.
over a period of time.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of it happened because Calcutta was the capital. And so a lot of people actually moved for work.
Yes.
So people actually moved for government service. And this is mostly would be upper caste, educated Hindu Bengalis
That's right.
would have moved earlier. And that's so like my family moved before the partition of Bengal. I mean, so they started moving.
So that means before 1905.
1902, 1903 is when my great grandfather had moved. And then my grandfather finally moved, and the whole family moved around 1920 or
Right.
so.
Right.
But that was moving for service, and the house was there, everything was there. And so this idea, and even post 1947, everyone had this idea that that house will still be there.
That's
No one thought that this is going away. In
Yes.
fact, there were lots of people who used to go back to their houses in the summer and used to live there.
So actually that border
That's right.
continues to be quite porous.
It's still
I
quite
have a
porous.
sari wala who comfortably walks across from comes to Delhi, sends me the most fabulous stuff. Then this time I said कि वापस कैसे जाओगे? अभी नहीं जाऊंगा, मेरा बेटी की यहाँ शादी हुई है कैलकाटा में, थोड़ी देर इधर रहूंगा फिर चला जाऊंगा.
Yeah.
So still very porous.
No,
Which
at
is
that
not
point of
true
time-
of Punjab.
That's right. At that point of time, there wasn't even really much of a border. I mean, it was kind of very much the border, only some fence in some areas got built in the late 50s.
Yeah.
There was nothing built before that. So people used to go back quite often. And I think it's because of this idea of relative privilege. And I think that was key because everyone there was always a watered down version, but people wanted to go back because that is where it wasn't watered down, right?
That's right. So that could well explain my father.
That's right.
Even though he wouldn't talk about it, but there's no doubt. And that's what, so even though then we always had liquidity shortage. I
That's
mean, I
right.
grew up with that. But yet, purchases were made carefully, but always of the finest quality. There was never anything that was cheap and cheerful just brought, you see, rather not have it.
That's right.
But when it comes, it must be of good quality, it must be expensive. The furniture, which has remained unchanged, but when it was bought, it was solid, glowing, teak, you know,
That's right.
and that comes from a sense of knowing
That's right.
a good life and what it's about and what it constitutes, which wouldn't have happened if they had not been the class that they had been back then.
So I have a story that spans across two generations. So my grandmother's grandfather, so he was very close to Mujibur Rahman,
Yes.
and we owned. So this was in this district called Madaripur in Bangladesh. So my family used to have like they had a business. They had a couple of oil mills, some movie theaters. Even like there was a road in that district named after my grandmom's grandfather. And then, so one day he was sleeping in the oil mill. So he would usually sleep there. But there was this just one particular day, and in fact, he had been warned before that the Razakars are after you, and like you should probably go back home, and you should probably sleep where the guards are there. You should not sleep alone in the mill. And that's the day when he was murdered. With like there were these big
The day
stone-
Mujibur Rahman was murdered.
No, no, not Mujibur Rahman. My grandmom's grandfather.
He was murdered.
He was murdered, and so that was one incident. And then later, my grandfather's dad, my great grandfather, in fact. So this was during the Operation Searchlight that was going on. So I think a little before the 1970s, and so the Razakars had informed everyone that whoever brings them the head of my great grandfather would be awarded 5 lakh rupees of that.
Oh my
time.
God, those days.
And so my great grandfather flew, like he escaped, and he was in these places called deeps, which are basically small islands, and he was hiding there. And my family, my grandmom, everybody, they had moved to India, and there were these refugee camps, and they were staying there. But my great grandfather was nowhere to be found for almost 8 months. And somehow, after 8 months, he came back, and so he was pretending to be a Christian. So he was in that typical some attire of some church with some cross lockets, so that he's not murdered. So, but after 8 months, I think then after Bangladesh became independent and things settled down, and the Indian government was also providing relief to these camps. But after when my family went back from this place called Chandan Nagar in West Bengal to Madaripur, they saw that there's nothing. Their house is not there, everything is burned. Though like the structure was there, so they started living there again. But then someone that they were very close to, a family friend who was living with them at the time, and one day he just walks out of the house, and then there's sounds of gunshots, and then he was murdered then and there. So that's when my family decided that we must move from here for good.
Oh God.
And then we came to Calcutta.
So then they sold up, or did they get compensation in Calcutta for what they lost in Bangladesh?
So this I'm not sure of whether they
Okay.
received any compensation or not. But after, so part of my family like has always been in Calcutta since then. But there was like my grandmother's brothers, they all moved back to Dhaka eventually in another 10 years. But my grandmom and her sisters were always, they have been staying in Calcutta ever since then, since 1971 in fact.
There's Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines also,
Yes,
which
yes.
describes the riots in just memorable.
So
It's
one
quite
thing,
very powerful.
so one thing that has always I've felt this, like I've seen this insecurity in my house, is that everybody's obsessed with lockers, keeping jewelry in lockers. Like there's a locker inside a locker, in fact, in my grandmother's house back in Calcutta. And even though now my family stays, someone stays in this part of the country, some other part, we always have these lockers, some 2, 3 lockers in the house. So this also stems from this insecurity that your property
We don't know
will be
when
lost.
you're going to have to run.
Yeah, because
Carry little trunk, little
Yeah.
whatever, trunkies to
because
just, yeah.
back then also they had to bury a lot of their jewelry under the ground so that it's not found and they have some sort of assets. And this is something that I can also relate to. So I stay in Lajpat, and I was speaking to my landlord one day that these cars in Delhi, especially near Lajpat, they have these locks, some yellow with the tire. And then I asked him why are there locks on cars, like super steep cars in the city? And then he's like, people are just insecure, and this is something that has been there since partition,
Yeah.
because people were
That's what
insecure
mother is
about
that,
losing
yeah.
their things. So even though like no one will come and steal your car, let's say, and even like very cheap cars also have these locks, but people are insecure, and that insecurity it is pervasive.
So my cousin compares, there were the refugee Sikhs like us who had come, and families are many of our Rishtedars who were right here. And my cousin is also from that side, right? He's my Mamaji's son. So he says, I can make out the difference because the ones from the refugee lot are hyper. So, if a Urika Sardar, we used to call them Urika, literally means yani day. So there's a government letter, they'll say, Acha chithi aayi hai. But the refugee response will be disproportionate reaction to anything related to government or a bill, because it's just a shock.
I think the equivalent for a lot of us might have been being an international student. When you see like a police person, any government person around, you'll be almost nervous.
Or the blacks, when they talk about it, they want to avoid being caught even at a traffic light.
Right. Yeah, you feel like you never belong.
You
and you're
don't know, you feel vulnerable. They'll be pulled on the side, and horrible thing, disproportionate like Floyd. They live with it every day.
There's a presumption of guilt.
Yeah.
In their cases. Are there any more questions?
Ma'am,
Stories.
yeah. So, in my father, I've seen like a paradox between philosophy and politics of Sikhism, as you mentioned that you like the philosophy of Sikhism. My father's Nana was a Ning, Kirpanda Ning, and he was very influenced by Guru Granth
By
Sahib.
Ning, you mean Nehang, what we call Nehang.
Hanji,
The blue.
Hanji Ning,
Ah.
Ning Singh.
Ah.
So my father was very influenced by his philosophy and the way he led his life. And my father, all this while, was clean-shaved himself. In 1984, my mother had her apprehensions in letting him be a Hindu in Punjab.
Oh, I
When
see.
he started wearing a turban.
I
And
see.
he's been wearing a turban ever since. And I've like always, everybody keeps on asking me if I'm a Sikh. I'm not a Sikh, but I am a Sikh.
Yeah.
My father is a kind of Sikh who we have a murti of Guru Nanak Dev Ji in our. Telling that my idol worship is not allowed in this guy kept on saying all his life. I don't make
Lovely. I think that's lovely. But my mother, in fact, she was a very, what shall I say, rebellious thinker. And that's because of her aunt, the ashram wale, and very lefty and so on. So this whole thing of no idol worship, my mother put it in my head. She says, we say no idol worship, but the way we treat the Guru Granth Sahib is like an idol. You carry on a head and the purification and itna. This is all ritual. So truly, if no idol worship, then it should be in your bookshelves. At best, like the Quran is kept within a particular outer cloth, in a cloth or whatever. So I have a Guru Granth Sahib. But not the I have the small Granthi, which in fact this aunt had given me. It's written in Hindi. And it was actually from Pakistan, I mean what is now Pakistan, and it was brought here, even though the other Guru Granth Sahib, which was written in Gurmukhi, was left there at Nankana Sahib. So they carried the Guru Granth Sahib when they were fleeing, left it at Nankana Sahib and then came across to Amritsar. But they brought this little Granthi because they felt that because it's written in Hindi, it will not be treated with the same respect. So basically, then I've got that Granthi, which I keep in my room, but I keep it wrapped in a cloth. But yes, idol worship is an interesting.
Yeah. I've also noticed there's a fluidity in practice and tradition between Hindu Punjabis and Sikhs.
Yes.
Because my family also keeps a Gurudhan side for some reason. Again, we are Hindus. So, but my father's always been drawn towards Gurdwaras. He's kept chadiyas. All of his best friends growing up were Sikhs. So
Okay.
my sister was married in a Gurdwara.
So the other early practices also were that Hindu households would have one son become a Sikh.
Okay.
That was also there because it was a way of, because really the army, it was creating an army to fight at that time Muslim oppression. So Hindus would then have, this whole thing of Sardar ke 12 baj gaye, it's today a joke. But actually, at the time of weddings, etc., because Sikh weddings happen in the day, broadside. But because of Mahurat, many Hindu weddings happen at night and so on. So the guard used to be provided because otherwise brides used to be carried off. So the Sikhs would guard the wedding places and guard the bride. So the change of guard would happen at 12. Yeah.
Makes a lot more sense. Any other stories, testimonies?
Yeah, so one story of the partition era that has sort of left a very deep mark on me is that of Pinjar, this story by
God, yes.
Amrita Preetham. And I remember as a teenager, my mother sort of introducing me to the story, and then also us
Your mother's
watching.
not there?
No. So my family isn't directly related to any of the partition era times, lived experiences in any way, apart from the fact that I've grown up in Lajpat Nagar and we've had neighbors who've shared stories.
Right.
But yeah, here in Lajpat Nagar, my mother we sat together and we watched this movie. And back then, I sort of, as in, I'm still carrying this doubt that I have about the protagonist, which I'll come to later. But the story sort of opened a Pandora's box for me because I was always drawn to partition era stories since then, since being introduced to Pinjar. And later on during graduation, I also sort of dealt with it more academically, where I explored themes of the commodification of women during these times and just the general dehumanization of them and them being treated like repositories of honor of not just their immediate communities, but entire nations. So all of that academic grappling I've done, but this doubt that I still have, or sort of an ideological difference that I felt with the protagonist at that time as a teenager when I first saw the movie, was her choice of not returning back when she was given the option of returning back to her home.
She had a child there.
Yeah, she
But
said
you see, here's the thing. I mean, why can't it be that she did want to stay, that she had grown roots, and she did have a child? Then, I mean, just because he's Muslim or whatever could have been abducting this well, but they have been.
So I was wondering if there are other real life instances that you've come across during your research where women have sort of made that choice, where they found agency.
So
regained it in
this
some way.
book, in this grandaunt's ashram in Punjab, there was a girl called Jeevan, who in fact I used to play with because I used to go there to the ashram. Basically, there were all these girls, women who it was great fun. So Jeevan, story was that she was running away, her family, she lost her entire family, and some may have crossed over to Pakistan. She's a Muslim. And then one communist leader at that time, Samundri, I've forgotten his first name, but I've mentioned him here. He found her under a bridge. She was hiding. And he then got her to Bibji's ashram. And Bibji first said that I'll have to change her name. And she would certainly have a memory of it because she would have been about 8 or 9 years old at that. And then they called her Jeevan. And then she continued to stay in the ashram. So there would have been certainly my grand aunt at that time and even Chulkhana, etc., were quite, I mean, Chulkhana stood for elections, was supposed to, Nehru said, I'll give you a ticket and this and that. And Nehru used to know my grand aunt quite well. So they would certainly know of the scheme. But Jeevan chose not to go back. Because she said, I don't know who I'll go to. And so now I'm Jeevan. I'm going to live here.
Other questions? I think some people have shared.
One quick
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Ma'am, so again, just to repeat, I've recently discovered a lot of partition history in my family. There are some pockets that I haven't fully looked about. But what I can understand by talking to these people who are still, for instance, my grandmom's sister, she's still alive, living in a tiny village in West Bengal. I've tried to poke and prod, but she refuses flat out to
Yes.
tell me the story. So my dad's generation, they don't know her story, for instance.
But then when would she have come? In 71?
No, in 47. 47 is when she made the switch. So she would have
From-
been Rajshahi, from Rajshahi in Bangladesh to
Right.
West
So it
Bengal.
was East Pakistan.
Pakistan. Yeah. And some similar other sort of incidents. And I know there's a lot of trauma because she's refused to tell the story from then, till now. So 2 generations have tried to. So my question really is, do I let this story die, or do I somehow try to get it out of?
So here's the thing. Whatever stories, that is true of people who suffered like this. They don't talk. My grandmother didn't talk. She didn't say, then this happened, then that happened. I felt like this. Out of that entire rich material, all I've got is this is just a portion of this book. That's why my approach has been not the stories itself, but it's received history and it's what I perceive. So they are different because of whatever happened. So we don't have to know what happened, but certainly we can explore who they are. And that then becomes the story.
Maybe how that's left a mark.
Yes, that then. I don't remember my father saying, he told me these some moments, but it's not. Rajkot was not discussed every day. It was a rare thing, which again I've mentioned, it was like as if they had their memories as their personal photographs, which they were scared of exposing to the sun by talking.
Yeah.
It shouldn't fade.
Mhm.
Right? But as time passed, somewhat the stories emerged. But still not entirely. There's just so much I don't know. But you did have writers like Manto, like Pritam. But those are stories, frankly, we are just grateful that I don't have a story like Thanda Gosht or Koldo, hai na? Or even Pinjar or so that is again the relative privilege.
Yeah.
And luck, sheer luck. The next train that my dad and all came back in from Lahore station. The next train is where everybody was saying that it was a body of a train of dead bodies that had arrived in Amritsar. So it was just luck. Yeah.
Right. I think that's also a good takeaway is that oral histories may not often be complete and they may be patchworky, but it's the
Always,
part
it's
of
received
it.
history. It's received history, and then then you will add your story, which is your interpretation, and that's how these things grow richly.
Right.
Yes.
And somewhere there's a thread of that, and you will have added your threads to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
That's also the beauty of it.
Yes.
That's very much what this book is also putting those puzzle pieces together.
Yeah,
The best
I
that you
mean, one of the criticisms of this book, almost uniformly, has been lack of structure. And some reviewers have said lack of structure, but we understand. A little irritating, but author can be forgiven because it's memory type of thing. But one is that, these are dazzling threads, but bewildering in the way they are clumped, a eulogy to a beautiful end. So everybody is confused about the structure. The truth is, I too grappled with it for a very long time. And then I realized I can't make it into a novel. I can't create somebody else who's my father. It's very, very personal. So it has to be like this because it is a personal memoir. So there are shades and pieces.
For sure.
Really.
I think that's something very pure stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's nice to kind of see you thinking aloud.
Yeah.
Right. I think those are some really great takeaways to how to talk to our grandparents about what happened during that time as well. Thank you so much again, ma'am, for taking on.
Thank you.
This
Thank
is
you
so
for
insightful.
having me. And the questions have been very engaging and I've enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
If I could ask you.
Yeah,
sign my
sure.
name as well. There's also some story on the wall if you want to.
Yeah. So you've underlined.
I've marked it up. I always use it.
Yes.